All right, it's Kaya here, and I am here to talk about the Good Eats article. Interestingly enough, I picked it before having watched the instruction video, so I was kind of amused that you went through the same one. I picked this though because we are starting our health and nutrition curriculum in first grade after spring break, which is in 2 weeks. So I was hoping to find some ideas and spark some ideas for how to integrate some of this within the first grade classroom because, let's be honest, a lot of these units are geared towards higher grades. So I was hoping to get a little bit of inspiration for the little guys. So let me get right into it. This Good Eats curriculum is a 3-unit year-long curriculum. And the units are broken down into, they call them sort of sub-units, but the first one is nutrition and you. It's sort of the personal approach, learning about your foods, the foods that are what your body needs. There's also a lot of science to it in terms of what are components of food, such as carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, analyzing and researching the food that you eat, dealing with diseases and disorders associated with food, for example, obesity, and finally a little bit of math thrown in there in one of the lessons within the subunit, calculating ideal weight, BMI, analyzing personal fitness, graphing that information with the class. So it's interesting how cross-curricular it is. That surprised me. And then there's a little bit of an activity lab at the end of that where they analyze diet, and there's laboratory work with rats. Had I known that, I would not have picked this. I think, sorry, as a personal note, animal experiments are vile, and so I was really bothered by this part, and I understand it's just an academic exercise, but animals in laboratories, I'm really, really bothered by. So, but there is an activity lab where students design an experiment and conduct this experiment using rats and modifying their diet and tracking their weight. And then they finally write a lab report, create an argument, analyze the argument, compare the data, things like that. The second unit is nutrition and society. So it builds based on what you already know and how body images affected by media and the things that we need to take care of ourselves, like eating right, getting sleep, and being active, and how perhaps body image is portrayed within the media. It also gets a little bit of language in here. There's food pyramids and work within Spanish. So this is a bilingual unit. This unit involves Fast Food Nation, evaluating nonfiction texts and videos, and also analyzing government role at all levels, so local, state, and federal, as first steps to reduce obesity. And also a little bit of historical piece in terms of what are some of the diet changes within the 20th century. This one, the second subunit, there's a big activity here where there's a mock congressional hearing where students present reform ideas within groups. That one surprised me as well. I found that to be a really interesting idea. Having done that in high school myself, I remember something like that pretty fondly. And the final the final lesson in Unit 2 is You Are What You Eat, where students synthesize their learning and then they actually deliver speeches to local middle school students. And then the third subunit here is Nutrition of the World. And this is where students start to focus on hunger and attention to it within a larger scale and roles of the international community within hunger, as well as genetically modified organizations, so GMOs. And now, interestingly, this lesson or unit was dated 2007. So I think some of this would have to be updated, but I like the fact that this was so long ago and yet it's mentioned and worked on in this unit. So you're looking at lessons that deal with hunger in poor countries, introducing poetry within that, looking at specific countries, and so some social studies and geography lessons with that. So poetry or an essay, looking at world famine and like some history of famines throughout the world. And again, students working with groups for some global problems having been addressed, and then reporting in groups information like in a PowerPoint or some other technological application that students could use to present information. The next one is genetically modified food. So this is again back to science and dealing with some genetic modification and the role of genetically modified crops related to food. So it's interesting how it's able to connect it back to food. And in this case, students are going to create a poster and illustrating the steps or the process for the genetic modification, a little bit of the science that I don't understand. So that was stressful, but it's interesting. And then also looking at as consumer advocates. So taking this genetic modification information as environmentalists, scientists, but also consumer advocates and legislators who are impacting food. And then there's something at the end called the power of two. And again, this one really surprised me in terms of the cross-curricular strategies used here, because in this case, they're looking at microloans to start businesses in smaller countries. The idea being that a lot of times families don't have the ability to pay for food, but they have the ability to start a business with whatever skills they may possess. And so this analyzes sort of some banking and finance information with an activity where it's called the power of two, where if two people each then donate $1, and then those people convince others to donate $1, it's sort of a pay it forward work. But they're looking at analyzing strategies. They're analyzing strategies for donations. They're calculating donations. They're graphing and analyze data for different scenarios of donations as well as populations, and creating visual posters to express that learning. The other component that I think is interesting to point out in this unit is that there's the essential question, which is, should we care about what we eat and why? And then there's also key questions that are developed within each unit pertaining to whether it's the nutrition in you, nutrition in the world. So there's definitely plenty of, I feel like, broader topics and ideas within this unit that could be addressed within the many curricular areas that are sort of laid out. So components of the unit within each lesson, you're going to find there are class discussions within each lesson, whether it's at the beginning of the lesson. Some of them are sort of embedded within the middle or end, but there's always a class discussion in there, which that's important when you consider Vygotsky's social learning. There's, again, small group work, sort of applying the same standard, but looking at small group work. There's plenty of research in here, not only with technology, but as well as the laboratory research. Again, the rats, but there's a variety of research options. There's also within each lesson, and not every one of them, but these are elements I pulled out. There's reflections, written reflections, as well as discussion reflections, journals, reports, like the laboratory reports, data trackers where they're graphing, the data, whether it be from the finance or the fitness levels of the class, oral presentations, so the mock Congress, as well as presenting their findings about nutrition to middle schools, and then again the graphing and equations. There's also a variety of assessments that are formative and summative, which within each lesson. How is this lesson? How does this curriculum utilize the linked learning lens? Well, so when we look at linked learning, we can remember that there's multiple components to it, but it's a strong academic component. There's a strong technological component. There's a work experience component, and then there's also support services component. And there's a very strong academic component within this unit just by looking at the cross-curricular demands. There's a career component, and some of the career components you're going to find in the additional variations at the end of each lesson. For example, in the first unit, there's potential to work with a nutritionist and potential medical opportunities within that as well when you're considering your own personal diet, your own personal nutrition needs, taking it further with your daily allowance, looking at vitamins. So there's a potential for scientists, doctors, nutritionists within the first one, for example. So that's where you kind of get the component in the real world experiences. The interesting part of this, though, it's not necessarily industry specific because, for example, the first one you could look at nutrition and health. The second unit, which is nutrition and society, you could get into legislatures, you could get into consumer advocates and lawmakers. And then the third unit, there's the interesting piece within the finance when we're looking at microloans. So though this is a really interesting unit that can be tied to linked learning, I don't find that it's necessarily connected to the pathways model that we saw in some of the videos. And then the technical component is pretty strong. Not every lesson utilizes technology in the same way. Sometimes students are viewing websites, sometimes students are viewing videos, sometimes they are researching. So there's a heavy technological component throughout this unit as well. Problem-based learning. I found there to be more components of problem-based learning, and just a random thought and or question and or statement. These components of problem-based learning I got straight out of the text, and I wasn't sure if I needed to simply say that as a part of this because I copied it word for word. So I wasn't sure how to cite it in an oral presentation, but this came straight out of the chapter in the text about problem-based learning. And so there's a problem statement here. And within each unit, there's also questions, key questions that handle problems, which are, how can I get a balanced meal, balanced nutrition? How can I look at world hunger? How can I look at the media's role of body image within society? So there's not only just the larger one within the whole unit, each subunit carries one as well. There's also various roles for students, everything from creating the poster to taking an active role in this sort of mock congressional hearing to laboratory research and writing the laboratory report. There are so many opportunities to analyze situations. For example, the laboratory one, students have to create an experiment, conduct an experiment, find the results, analyze the results, share the results. So each subunit has opportunities to analyze whether it be data or findings or circumstances or situations within the lessons. There's a few group investigations, but there's a ton of group work. And finding analysis and share opportunities, again, I'll refer back to that laboratory one where the students find their analysis within the work with the rats, and then they then have opportunities to share it within the classroom. So whether it be through a PowerPoint or whether it be sharing through to middle school students in another circumstance, there are built-in opportunities to share. And again, the various assessments. So some of them are worksheets, some of them are PowerPoints, some of them are posters, some of them are within the mock congressional hearing. So there's a variety of assessment options through this. The interesting part about this unit is that at the end of each lesson, there's a section on how to enhance the lesson, how you could vary it or extend it. And this is where I looked at how to enhance the PBL part of it, where like for example, lesson 1-2, students can have opportunities to further analyze foods from menus, like in restaurants, and they can also look at recommended daily allowance from vitamins. So they can take in some pharmacology into that. At 1-4, they can compare class data. Their students are looking mathematically at comparing fitness levels within the class, and they can also compare that with local, state, or national averages, and they can analyze that data. And then from subunit 2, students get to design their own questions for that mock congressional hearing. So asking questions and having those questions be valued and important would be another way to extend some of that. So I picked out 3 that I liked, but there's plenty of them within the entire unit at the end of each lesson. And I'm sorry, I only have a minute left, so I'm going to try to get this one quick. The idea of how this also is a constructivist unit, I find that all over it, interestingly enough. There's big concepts. So you've got your overarching idea of, should we care about what we eat? But then there's also, they expand. So you start out with, how does it affect me personally? How does it affect me in a society? And then globally, students' questions and interests are valued. There's a class discussion in every lesson, as well as group work. Learning builds on what student knows. There's actually instructions in here saying only do this lesson if you've completed 1.2 and 1.4. So it does build. There's a variety of assessments as well as the process, and students work in group in almost every lesson. So there's loads of opportunity for social learning and group work, and I'm out of time. Thank you.